Previously on Kings and Kingdoms Divided, we've been talking about the southern portion of God's people in this sliced kingdom now. So we're looking at Judah, and Asa is ruling over that. How would you say overall things are going under Asa's reign in Judah? Good, you got a thumbs up. I'd agree with you. You recall our memory verse? We had 1 Kings 15 in the 11th verse. Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as did his father David, and immensely blessed. And there's this time of peace. Things are going terrifically. And here's why. Asa is leading God's people and trusting in the Lord. And hey, as long as we're on God's side, God's with us, and we are good, well, he's going to be given an ultimatum. He's going to have an opportunity to shift that allegiance today. And let's see what he does with it as we continue our discussion in 1 Kings 15. Turn there if you haven't already. 1 Kings 15. Good morning, by the way, and welcome into our Bible study. So, as we pick up, we have all these reforms leading us through verse 15. Things are going very well, but then there's going to be this ugly, nasty threat that rears its head up in the north. Verse 16 of 1 Kings 15 tells us, "Now there was war between Asa and Baasha, king of Israel, all their days." That doesn't sound good. Is this new, though? Okay, going back to verse 7 of chapter 15, at the end of it. "And there was war between Abijam and Jeroboam." Those were the previous kings, by the way. And you trace it backward from there into chapter 14, 1 Kings 14, and toward the end of the chapter in verse 30. "And there was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam all their days." So there's been this conflict now for decades in the division of this kingdom, and we're not being told anything new in verse 16 as far as a change in conditions. It's just the continuance of what's already been in place. So we look in verse 17, "And Baasha," who's this new king in Israel, Baasha, king of Israel, came up against Judah and built Ramah, or we often say it as Ramah, I probably will throughout, "that he might let none go out or come in to Asa, king of Judah." I'm going to show a couple of maps here now in sequence. And the first one of these, you can see Ramah or Ramah, and that's going to be basically right in the center. Go straight across. You see that right in the center of the screen? I know the print's not extremely large for those toward the back. I tell you what, turn around and look back there if you need to. That's pretty handy, isn't it? But you can see Ramah in the middle of the screen, and this is the place that's built up. And this happens at the hands of Baasha, who's king of Israel. He comes against Judah, builds this place so that none will go out or come in to the south. Okay, and that's to Asa, who is king over Judah. If you'll notice a lot of these little text boxes and all of these red arrows, and I know it's not just clearly delineated here, but do you see where all this stuff's going on our map? It's not just Ramah, but as well, almost all of this stuff, with a few exceptions, is in the middle of the screen. Why do you think there's so much activity during this period of hostility in the middle of our screen? What's that, Justin? Okay, so yes, solidarity in numbers, yeah, okay. What else? Well, this is kind of a buffer zone right here. This is the border. Isn't that where a lot of activity does tend to happen? It's along national borders. We see that and know about that even today in our country, what's going on. Well, there's all this activity, all this conflict, most of which is taking place in this buffer zone right along this boundary between these two nations of God's people. By the way, this takes place in the year 894 BC, and this is the 36th year of the kingdoms of Judah and Israel as they divided. So we progressed quite a bit as we're discussing things here. About 36 years in, 894 BC. And notice it's Baasha, who's the king in the north, who builds this place, Ramah. I ask you to keep your spot. Turn over to Joshua chapter 18. So we're going to trace backward just a hair. Joshua 18. And I'd like to consider verses 20, about in the middle of it, down through 28, the end of this chapter. But in doing that, I'm thankfully, for my sake, if not for yours, I'm not going to go through and read all of these names, but I do want to point out some of these significant ones. Before we read it, though, the southern territory is composed of what two tribes? Obviously, the big one is named after that. Okay, Judah, but we don't want to forget there is another tribe that sometimes gets lost in this shuffle. And what's its name? Benjamin. Benjamin, just slightly to the north. Okay? Now, here's why this is significant. I got to thinking about this and I had to check back and confirm this to be the case. But Joshua 18, the middle of verse 20, this is the inheritance of the people of Benjamin, according to their clans, boundary by boundary, all around. Now the cities of the tribe of the people of Benjamin, according to their clans, were Jericho, Beth-Hoglah. So you see why I'm not going to read all these? Okay. Significant. Okay, Jericho certainly stands out. Bethel, we know that place. Maybe you're familiar with Ophrah. Geba, that's going to be relevant for us today. 12 cities within their villages. Gibeon, we recognized. Ramah or Ramah. Mizpah, that will be important going down in verse 27. Jebus, which is the ancient name of what's still known today as Jerusalem by this point. Kirjath-Jearim, Gibeah, 14 cities with their villages. Point being this is the inheritance of the people of Benjamin according to its clans. Thank you for that information, Mr. Joshua. Now let's go back to our text of 1 Kings 15, and let's refresh ourselves on what we just read in verse 17. And Baasha, king of Israel, came up against Judah, because remember, there's war going on in all of their days. And he built Ramah, that he might let none go out or come in to Asa, king of Judah. Baasha is in control of Ramah. To whom does Ramah belong? To Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin, and therefore, kingdom-wise, 100%, Roy, it belongs to Judah. Now, it's unclear whether this has just now been taken or maybe this has been the case some point in the past, but one thing is for certain, this is territory that rightly belongs to Judah, and Baasha has come in control of it. Verse 18, then Asa took all the silver and gold that was left in the treasuries of the house of the Lord, and the treasuries of the king's house. And remember, times aren't quite as wonderful and abundant as what they once were, but everything that's left, takes them out of the temple, takes them out of what belongs to him and to his family, and delivered them into the hand of his servants. And King Asa sent them to Ben-Hadad, the son of Tabramon, the son of Hazion, king of Syria, who dwelt in Damascus, saying, let there be a treaty between you and me, as there was between my father and your father. See, I have sent you a present of silver and gold. They don't have a lot of extra of that right now. Come and break your treaty with Baasha, king of Israel, so that he will withdraw from me. I'd like to show you this second map now at this point. And I know some of it's a little bit blurry, but the individual cities aren't quite as important here. What it is very colorful, and my mind operates like a 3-year-old's, and I like this map because of all the color splash that's found on it, but also because of the delineation between nations as well as tribes. These are relevant to us at the moment. Of course, we know that Baasha is right down here outlined by the red, and then if you go up in the, tannish maybe color that you have in Syria up here to the north and to the northeast. And then, of course, Israel is outlined by the blue. Baasha and Israel have had this treaty with their neighbors to the north, which makes a lot of diplomatic sense. But what happens here with Judah, essentially, is Asa outbids the services of Baasha, and he says, hey, why don't you break that contract, and let's make a contract together. The reason being that in this buffer zone, Baasha is threatening, and it appears making a little progress down toward the capital city. And so he buys this alliance with the king up to the north, Ben-Hadad, and to break the alliance that he has currently in place through this treaty with Baasha. And the beauty and the benefit of this is, hopefully he can relieve some of that pressure along his own northern border. Well, let's see if this works, this strategy. Verse 20. So Ben-Hadad, who's the king up to the north and northeast of Syria, heeded King Asa, who's king of Judah in the south, and sent the captains of his armies against the cities of Israel. Most of these we're not going to find on the map, but a couple of places, or a few places here we will. He attacked Ijon, Dan, Abel Beth Maacah, and all Kinnereth, with all the land of Naphtali. So the Syrian neighbor up to the north attacks. You see that little tribe area of Dan and Laish. You may be familiar with it. I know it's kind of blurry on the screen, but the white there. So Syria comes in and he penetrates this area. Dan, 2 or 3 of the places we don't have listed. Some of them we're uncertain about their location. But we definitely know the location of the tribe of Naphtali. Essentially, he's just attacking right here, right along the northern border, which he would have to do being the northern neighbor. Remember, these attacks and advances before are coming against Judah from Israel, right along the border in the territory of Benjamin. But now he has all this conflict from the purchase of King Asa in this treaty up to the north. Is it a worthy investment? Does it pay off for King Asa and for Judah? By the way, I didn't mention Kinneroth. I did bring this out a few class periods ago. What is Kinneroth in the Old Testament? Or you might have seen it as Kinnereth with a K. That's another name for Galilee later on. You look up, I've done this before. You do a search in the Old Testament for Galilee and you won't find a single reference. It's not because it doesn't exist back then. It's just known by a different name. It's Kinneroth. And in the New Testament, it's known by Galilee. And one's more Greek and one Hebrew. That's the backgrounds of it. So does it pay off? Is this worth it? All this going on, though, this activity in the north. Verse 21, now it happened when Baasha heard it, that's the king of Israel, that he stopped building and perhaps even invading Judah to the south, Ramah, and he remained in Tirzah instead. Well, what significance does Tirzah, the town, hold to us? Tirzah, back in this time. And for this, I'm going to switch locations. Look, Tirzah is well up to the north. You're looking there at least about midway or 3/4 up, possibly even from the Dead Sea as far as latitude goes, on the west side of the Jordan River, almost the very top of the screen in the center. Tirzah, what significance does that hold at this time? Anybody remember that one? This is where the king's been living. You recall Jeroboam, and initially you have down in Bethel, Shiloh, those places are more important, but then it gets moved where the king is living up to Tirzah. And so that's the relevance, and he goes back, as you might be able to read in the little text box. He's forced to retreat back to where he's living and his capital. He can't focus on the south because now he has to focus on the northern border and the things that are going on up there. Turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 14. This is the parallel to what we're reading right now. We're using the Chronicles more as a help with supplementary information. And I know we looked at chapters 14 and 15 last week of 2 Chronicles, but I want to be reminded of something very important. 2 Chronicles 14, beginning in verse 9. This has just a little bit of length to it, so bear with me and follow along. It'll help attention-wise. We're told that while Asa is in power, and actually if you go back up into verse 8, Asa had an army of 300,000 from Judah, armed with large shields and spears, and 280,000 men from Benjamin that carried shields and drew bows. All these were mighty men of valor. Roughly 600,000 foot soldiers is what he has. That's a lot, over 500,000. But he has a problem on his hands. Verse 9, Zerah the Ethiopian, down from the southwest, came out against them with an army of 1,000,000 men. And in addition to this, 300 chariots, and came as far as Mareshah. So they traveled hundreds of miles, possibly even close to 1,000, depending on where Ethiopia is at this time. They travel many hundreds of miles, and they come to the kind of bottom left portion of the screen to Baasha, and you might recall the battle that takes place just to the north of this in the valley of Zephathah. But they're in trouble. They're outnumbered, the people of Judah, 2-1, roughly. And then that doesn't account for the chariots also, so we have a real problem on our hands. Verse 10, Asa went out to meet him. They drew up their lines of battle, as I mentioned, in the valley of Zephathah at Marishah. And Asa, though, cried to the Lord his God. One of the most beautiful pleas of Scripture that you're ever going to find. And what a great reminder for us. When we're facing an opponent, and it feels like in a battle that we cannot win, it may be that we cannot win on our own. We always have hope. But the key is this. We have to keep our trust in the Lord. Make sure our allegiance is strong to Him and to Him alone. That's what Asa does. He cries to the Lord his God, O Lord, there is none like you to help. Between the mighty and the weak, help us, O Lord God, for we rely on you. And in your name we have come against this multitude. O Lord, you are God. Let not man prevail against you. So the Lord defeated the Ethiopians before Asa and before Judah, and the Ethiopians fled. Asa and the people who were with him pursued them as far as Gerar. If you look on the map, that's in the very bottom left portion of the screen. That's about 70 miles down to the southwest. They chased this enemy, being outnumbered 2-1, and even with the 300 chariots, they can't stand before them. And the Ethiopians fell until none remained alive, for they were broken before the Lord and his army. The men of Judah carried away very much spoil, and they attacked all the cities then around Gerar, this territory of the Philistines, for the fear of the Lord was upon them. They plundered all the cities, for there was much plunder in them. They struck down the tents of those who had livestock and carried away sheep in abundance and camels, and they returned to Jerusalem. Now God shows his gratitude. Now it's funny. God's done all this work, and then he, in a way, he kind of shows his appreciation for this king who showed such greater even dependence upon him than what he has in the beginning of his reign. Chapter 15, verse 1. The Spirit of God came upon Azariah, the son of Oded, and he went out to meet Asa and said to him, Hear me, Asa, and all Judah and Benjamin. The Lord is with you. As you've seen, I've demonstrated this to you, while you are with him. If, this is the key, if you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you. But for a long time, Israel was without the true God and without a teaching priest, without law. But when in their distress they would turn to the Lord, the God of Israel, and sought him, he was found by them. In those times there was no peace to him who went out or to him who came in, for great disturbances afflicted all the inhabitants of the land. They were broken in pieces. Nation was crushed by nation, and city by city, for God troubled them with every sort of distress. But it'll be different for you, or at least it can be. Take courage. Continue to do what you've done here. Cry out for me. Keep your relationship with me strong. Do not let your hands be weak, for your work shall be rewarded. I know it's a little bit of a lengthy reading, but I want to remind of this condition. Verse 2. The Lord is with you while you are with him. If you seek him, his help, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, part of which is understood, if you don't seek out his help, then he will forsake you. And in translation, he will not help you. So as we go back to this dilemma that's being faced by Asa, the king in the south, there is a threat from Baasha in the north. And so what does he do this time for help? It's never mentioned. He even talks to God about it. He thinks, I'll just take care of this on my own. Well, I can't do it on my own, but I know this really strong, powerful kingdom up to the north. I bet we can buy them off, and we can get protection that way. And, you can say that I guess for the time being it works. Is it a good strategy, though, for the long haul? Because it violates the conditional promise that God has made to King Asa, as Roy advertised to us last week. Let's go back to our text now in 1 Kings 15, our main one. Yes, 1 Kings 15, and Joe's going to go right ahead, sir.
one real good point on the comparison between each of those situations was, look what it cost him for the protection in the instance of the first example, and yet at the end of the second example, he's benefiting from all the plunder and everything that they were able to bring back home from the spoils of that victory that God gave him. Cost him nothing, he profits from it, where in the first case, it cost him quite a little bit. Basically the entire treasury.
Yeah, very good. Very good, Joe. And just taking it back a step also, could it be that once he gets all this stuff, that he puts his trust in stuff once again? But like you say, then he has to give away all this stuff, if that's the case, in which he has his trust. So everything he gained the first time, he loses the second go-around. That's a great point. Thank you.
That we can do before we turn to God, which should have been our first course in the first place.
And our founding fathers, we should have been annihilated in the Revolutionary War. What did they do? They turned to and they appealed to God for intervention. I mean, we the people had little to nothing early on in the colonial days. Our ancestors had turned to God, and now look at where we are. We've reaped the benefits of that. God has immensely blessed our country. But how much do we turn to God now? Or do we turn to the state for help? Whether it's our own state or to states around us and all these alliances and treaties into which we enter. So yeah, thank you for that insight, Joe. Anything else before we move on? We are in verse 22. Then King Asa made a proclamation throughout all Judah. None was exempted. And they took away the stones and timber of Ramah, which Baasha had used for building. And with them King Asa built Geba of Benjamin and Mizpah. So let's look back on our map right here. Ramah, almost dead center of the screen, was being built and perhaps has even been taken over by Baasha, or maybe it's already under Israelite control by this point. But all these resources, the timber and the stones, are stripped and deconstructed from that place, and they're used to build up Geba, which is just slightly to the east, and then Mizpah, which is a little bit to the northwest. So there are some advances that are made now by Judah as a result of this decision that the king has made. By the way, we talked about why these places would be important and strategic. They're within this buffer zone, but I think there's something else to it also. Well, why would Baasha concentrate on this one place, Ramah? I looked up these words in Hebrew and their meanings. Ramah means hill. All right, so that would make a lot of sense. Constructing this as a strategic point of conflict and overlook, that kind of thing. But then they tear all this down and they build to the east with the materials, and they build to the northwest. Well, why these spots as far as Asa, king of Judah? Geba means, buckle your seatbelt, hill. Mizpah means watchtower. The second portion of the word, which is tower or hill, towering over the others, the point of which to keep watch. In military conflict, you always want the high ground, right? For two reasons. One is the watching, but also even fighting. It's a lot easier to do something downhill than it is doing it uphill. So I think that's probably why these places are selected. Verse 23, the rest of all the acts of Asa, all his might, all that he did, and the cities which he built, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? A chunk of which we've read, we know that. But in the time of his old age, he was diseased in his feet. What's exactly his problem? Well, we're not told. Maybe it's something with circulation, could be diabetes, but he battles some kind of ailment for several years at the end of his life, and then comes to a close. Verse 24, so Asa rested with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David, that's Jerusalem, his father. Then Jehoshaphat, his son, reigned in his place. So a couple of things here. Chronology. We are now at 869 BC. 869 BC. So put that in your mind and store it away. We're 31 years past that century mark of 900 BC. it can get a little confusing at times. So we covered a lot of the north and what happens, and then we need to switch over to the south and go through certain reigns, and we've done that. Well, now we're about to switch back over to the north and recover some of our tracks. And I'll tell you about that time frame in just a moment. But first, I want to go to 2 Chronicles chapter 16. 2 Chronicles 16. I want to talk just a little bit more because we read, hey, the rest of Asa and things attached to this, details. Can you not find out about those in another writing, in the Chronicles? Well, let's go back and let's consider if God has anything to say about the consequences of this choice that he makes when he provides this conditional promise. If you will do as you did against Zerar, wasn't it, or along those lines, the Ethiopian with me, and you seek me out, I'll be found by you, I'll bless you. But if you do not seek me out, the opposite is going to be characteristic. So let's look in 2 Chronicles 16, starting in verse 6. Then King Asa took all Judah, and they carried away the stones of Ramah and its timber, with which Baasha had been building, and with them he built Geba and Mizpah. Well, we know that. That's just a carbon copy of what we read. But this is new information that we didn't know prior. Verse 7. At that time, Hananiah the seer came to Asa, king of Judah, and said to him, because you relied on the king of Syria and did not rely on the true king, the Lord your God, the army of the king of Syria has escaped you. In other words, you could have taken over these people. You could have ruled them. You wouldn't have had to pay for their services. You could have taken all their treasures, just like you did down to the southwest. You could take all of this from the northeast, if only you'd relied on God. But now all your treasures gone. Were not the Ethiopians and the Libyans a huge army, 1,000,000? You're outnumbered 2-1 with very many chariots, 300 of which were told, and horsemen, yet because you relied on the Lord, he gave them into your hand. For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth, to give strong support to those whose heart is blameless toward him. You have done foolishly in this. From now on you will have wars. Now remember, there's finally peace, and the time of Asa, and I know there's still some concern with Israel, but not as much from the north. Everyone's been bombarded with these conflicts, not during a lot of the time of Asa. But he says, from now on, you're going to be just like all the others who didn't rely on the Lord. Now you're going to have wars. And what does that do to an economy? You are going to be depleted economically. Your people are going to die. Verse 10, then Asa was angry with the seer. Don't hate the message. Hate the messenger, right? And he put him in the stocks in prison, for he was in a rage with him because of this. And Asa inflicted cruelties upon some of the people at that time. This is probably those who remain true to the Lord's cause and support the prophets. Verse 11, the acts of Asa from first to last are written in the book of the kings of Judah and Israel. Isn't that neat how they cross-reference each other as reliable information? Hey, go back to Kings if you want to know more about this, but we're in Chronicles right now. In the 39th year of his reign, Asa was diseased in his feet, and his disease became severe. So now we know that's the problem of why he dies, which would make sense from Kings. But listen to this. Yet even in his disease, he did not seek the Lord. This is a proud, arrogant man in his old age. Go ahead. Wait just one sec, if you will, Roy. Sorry. Thank you, Parker. Yes, go ahead, sir.
I've heard Christian scientists make reference to this verse.
Okay. Yeah. Well, God can help, can he? He's the great healer, the great physician, most importantly of the soul. But there are certainly things that he can do for the body if we seek him out and his benefit. Asa doesn't. He's too proud. Joe?
Here's another opportunity for him to go to the Lord. You know, it's been discussed. He goes to Syria first, then he calls out to the Lord because he has nothing else, no other option. Yeah. Here's another opportunity, you know, that's pointed out here for him to go to the Lord. And he can't get, I'm sure all the physicians, I'm sure every medical professional he had access to tried to help. Man couldn't fix this, but again, he's forgotten, you know. And and it kills him. I think it's very interesting that this comes right on the heels of a description of him basically not doing what a good king would and getting angry at a prophet and throwing him in jail and so on. Not that God sent this disease on him, but that it was allowed to happen, and God's giving him an opportunity through that to return back to him, but he refuses.
Right. That's a good reminder, Joe. Why does God let so much hardship come on us? James chapter 1, right? Count it all joy when you enter into various trials, not because the trials are fun, but because through them we have the opportunity to grow our character. A major part of which is, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask. Make sure you're talking to God regularly. And goes on to say, but make sure you ask in faith and ... Make sure your trust and your alliance is primarily found there, right? So Asa has this disease, but he does not seek the Lord. But as Joe pointed out, he sought help from physicians. He's relying only on physical means. There's nothing wrong with using physical means. And in fact, when another king down the road in Judah, Hezekiah, is going to be sick, God actually says, whenever he seeks out his help, okay, I'll heal you. And then he says it's going to be through this physical means that it's going to happen. Here, go get these leaves and put them on your malignant boil. And sure enough, he gets better from that. So the issue isn't a use of the physical, but it's an ignoring of the spiritual, not primarily relying upon God. Verse 13, and Asa slept with his fathers. In other words, he died because he didn't seek out the Lord's help. He's too proud. Dying in the 41st year of his reign, in the tomb that he had cut for himself. Always looking out for himself, isn't he? In the city of David, and they laid on him a bier that had been filled with various kinds of spices prepared by the perfumer's art, and they made a very great fire in his honor. Maybe this is kind of like the eternal flame or something along those lines. So going back to our main spot of 1 Kings 15, there is some very important supplementary information that's found in 2 Chronicles, and that's why these two are so vital alongside one another. So the ending of Asa's reign, not nearly as good as what the beginning is. And maybe he starts to rely on himself and on the blessings that have been provided instead of the blesser of those things. Well, I told you we're going to shift directions, and that's exactly what transpires now in verse 25. So we cover this long stretch in Israel, and then we switch over, rewinding this long stretch in Judah until we get caught up and past. And now we're going to rewind a bit and cover this same amount of stretch in Israel. Verse 25, now Nadab the son of Jeroboam became king over Israel in the 2nd year of Asa, king of Judah, and he reigned over Israel 2 years. Asa, just as a reminder, reigned how many years? 41 years. So we're rewinding now in Israel to the north back to the 2nd year of Asa. So how many years are we going back? Very good, 39 years. This is 909 to 908 BC that Nadab the son of Jeroboam becomes king and he reigns over Israel. Verse 26. Okay. Verse 26, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord and walked in the way of his father, that is Jeroboam. Remember, we're back in the north of Israel. And in his sin, by which he had made Israel sin. Then Baasha. So we've been reading some about Baasha, who's been in place, but it's only because of the involvement of Asa, who's ruling in the south. Now we're actually strictly going to talk more about Baasha in the north. Then Baasha, the son of Ahijah of the house of Issachar, conspired against him, that is Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, and Baasha killed him at Gibbethon. And if you'll look on the map, Gibbethon's kind of in that buffer zone between Israel and Judah, but also it's in a triple spot of heat because that's over in the land of the Philistines. It's cut out in this sliver to the west that borders the Mediterranean Sea. Now Nadab, he has gone out against the Philistines to try to retake this area for Israel, and we're told that Baasha conspires against him in his own nation. While his own people are out fighting battle, he goes and he ambushes them, and Baasha killed them at Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines. while Nadab and all Israel laid siege to Gibbethon. We're going to go to Roy here in just a moment, but as we're waiting for that to come to, I want you to think about this for a minute. What kind of a person attacks his own countrymen when they're out defending, or even if they're on the offensive trying to take land, including the ruler of his own people? What kind of a man would you say that is? Well, that's the type of reign that Israel's going to have under Baasha. Yes, sir.
I just had a question about Gibbethon. I thought that was, it says it belonged to the Philistines here, but I thought that they were occupied by the Danites.
What's that, Gibbethon?
Gibbethon, yes.
Do you have a reference on
Earlier, well, I don't remember exactly where, but earlier in the scriptures, I remember reading about Gibbethon being on the border with the Philistines, and that it was occupied by the Danites.
Gotcha. And that would make a lot of sense. And probably some of this land shifted around during this point. And of course, all the enemies are to be cast out, and all the Philistines and a number of the others aren't. And not only do the Israelites adopt their practices, but also some of these slowly infiltrate back into what's now Israelite land and take over some of these spots. And that could be, could be. Or cabinet even. Yeah, good. Army would make a lot of sense. He might be a part of the administration. We understand Jeroboam, he has a part in the administration and ruling also, and rebels, and yeah, probably something similar. Right, Roy, thank you for those. Probably so. So verse 28, Baasha killed him, that is the ruling king, Nadab, who's the son of Jeroboam, in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, so he only reigns for 2 years, and he reigned in his place. That's about 908 BC, just as a reminder. And so it was, when he became king, that he killed all the house of Jeroboam. He did not leave to Jeroboam anyone that breathed until he had destroyed him, according to the word of the Lord, which he had spoken by his servant Ahijah the Shilonite, because of the sins of Jeroboam, which he had sinned, and by which he had made Israel sin, because of his provocation with which he had provoked the Lord God of Israel to anger. Now the rest of the acts of Nadab, remember, the son of Jeroboam, and I'm emphasizing that because this is a fulfillment of the prophecy that God makes about Jeroboam. Judgment back in chapter 14 is not just coming on you, but as well as coming to all of your house. Now the rest of the acts of Nadab and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles? See the constant reference between the two of the kings of Israel. And there was war between Asa and Baasha, king of Israel, all their days. Go figure. Constantly conflict. So often we think, well, the answer to our problems is just an all-out division. And if we'll just split off from each other and we'll just divide, that'll be the end of our division. Well, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? That's just the start of a whole lot more headache. And it continues to be that way for Israel. Verse 33, and this is going to be the introduction to much turmoil in the northern portion of the kingdom. I say much, even more than what we've already had. 33, in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, Baasha, through treachery, treason, became king of over all Israel in Tirzah. Now remember, I'll go back to our map right over here. Tirzah, that's the place up on the north central portion of the screen. That's where Jeroboam reigned. It was moved. I said earlier Shiloh. I was off on that. It's another S. It's Shechem is where it is to start with. But it's been moved there, and it stays there under multiple kings, the palace. He reigned over all Israel in Tirzah, and he reigned for a chunk of time, 24 years. However, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He walked in the way of Jeroboam and in his sin by which he had made Israel sin. Even though he's his enemy, he continues in all of his wicked ways, and he acts really just like him. Chapter 16, verse 1. Roy, as you're flipping over if you need to, chapter 16, verse 1, we'll pick up in just a moment.
I want to ask you, it seems that Baasha was being used by God to do away with Nadab and the Jeroboam family.
Yeah, it does seem, so what Roy said is that God is using Baasha to execute judgment and his vengeance is just on Jeroboam and on his family with Nadab. No doubt that's correct. Now, the question is this. Just because God is using him, does that mean what Baasha was doing is right? All right, we're going to address that, aren't we, in chapter 16. Good, Roy. Verse 1, Then the word of the Lord came to Jehu, the son of Hanani, against Baasha, saying, Inasmuch, and this is God speaking, inasmuch as I lifted you out of the dust, you were nothing. By the way, kind of like Jeroboam. Remember, Jeroboam's he's a nobody. He comes from these lowly origins. It appears his father has passed away, so he doesn't even have a dad living, and comes from this very small village. We know nothing about it. His mother's name means leper, perhaps describes her condition. From rags, God lifts him and takes him to riches. And then he uses this same type of guy, I believe, to overthrow Jeroboam, and consider the treatment he's going to receive, especially in our memory verse here in just a couple down. He said, Inasmuch as I lifted you out of the dust, you were nothing, and I made you everything. Ruler over my people, Israel, what an honor. And yet you have walked in the ways of Jeroboam, and have made my people Israel sin to provoke me to anger with their sins. And who would like to say verse 3? That's our memory work for the day. 1 Kings 16:3. Okay, Karen, go right ahead. Excellent. Very well done, Karen. So God says, hey, I'm going to take away your offspring. I'm going to take away your blessings and also those of your house. And I'm going to make your house just like, I think he's used this guy who in every way is just like Jeroboam to teach a valuable lesson. Now you're going to become just like Jeroboam in the end also. If you're interested in that, we could go back and read in 2 Chronicles 14, but we won't do that at the moment. Verse 4, the dogs shall eat whoever belongs to Baasha and dies in the city, and the birds of the air shall eat whoever dies in the fields. Now, why is this such a bad thing? I mean, does it really matter what happened? I'm not trying to be like gross or disrespectful, but, once we're gone, we're gone. Well, why is this such a big deal? He's insinuating what is not going to happen with Baasha's closeness, burial, and in the ancient, and really even in our times to a great degree, that's considered one of the most disgraceful things. And we know what happens like with the pharaohs and their grand tombs that were built for them. For people who are high-ranking, they're given great honors and burials. And he's saying you're going to be treated like the dust of the earth, like dogs, which are cast-off scavengers in that area. Your bodies aren't even going to be buried. You're going to be eaten by the animals that surround. Joe?
As he was laid in a tomb that he himself had built on a bed covered in spices. There was a great burning, so there was a ceremony of sorts. This king gets nothing. Yeah.
That's a nice but not so nice contrast, isn't it? Thank you, Joe, for that reminder. Yeah. And again, as we discussed last week, was Asa perfect in his reign? No, far from it, and the end's not good at all. Nevertheless, it does seem that the Lord has at least given him a little bit of dignity in his burial, and still some gratitude for how he's introduced all these religious reforms and a lot of positive things, right? Baasha is completely rotten to his core from beginning to end, and so God pays the respect that's due to him. Thank you, Joe. Verse 5, Now the rest of the acts of Baasha, what he did and his might, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? So Baasha rested with his fathers and was buried in Tirzah. Let's back up the place. Okay. And so going back to, the dog shall eat whoever belongs to Baasha and dies in the city. The birds of the air shall eat whoever dies in the field. So that's about all those that are connected to him. So actually about the king himself, there is a little bit of dignity, it does appear there. At the end of verse 6, Then Elah his son reigned in his place. And this is going to take place in 885 BC. I just mentioned it briefly. But does anybody recall where we left off in the southern portion, in Judah? What year? Very good. Okay. That's impressive there. 869 BC. And at this point in time, we have 885 BC, and Elah, that is Baashah's son, reigns in his place. So we have a separation of 16, depending on how you're going to count it, 17 years, which tells us we still have some catching up to do in the northern kingdom. So next week, we're going to talk more about the northern kings before we'll switch back over to the southern ones. Verse 7, and also the word of the Lord came by the prophet Jehu, the son of Hanani, against Baasha and his house, which sounds like a repetition. When you go back to verse 1, what takes place is this message that's presented to the prophet, and now it appears that he takes that message and he's delivering what it is the Lord has spoken to him. Because of all the evil that he did in the sight of the Lord, and provoking him to anger with the work of his hands, in being like the house of Jeroboam, and because he killed them. God used them to execute this judgment, but the way he executed this judgment was not the divine way of doing things. He essentially became a vigilante, and he rebelled against the authority that God had put into place. But it's a classic instance, 2 Timothy 2, of Romans 9. Every one of us is going to be used as a vessel of God. There are some vessels that are used for honor, gold and silver, but there are some vessels that are used for dishonor. We're told, however, we present ourselves into the Lord's hands is how he will choose to use us as vessels of honor, deeds of honor, vessels of dishonor, and deeds of dishonor. Unfortunately, Baasha chooses the latter, and so he meets the same end as Jeroboam. And he becomes yet another countless statistic in those who refuse to learn from the lessons of history. When we don't learn from history, we just repeat it over and over. Any closing comments through verse 7 of chapter 16? Yes, we're going to go to Roy. And while Parker's making his way, I'll ask you, if you will, please read the remainder of chapter 16 and study that a little bit. And let's do near the end, verse 33, because as bad as things seem right now in Israel, they're going to get considerably worse, believe it or not. So verse 33 will be our memory verse. Read the remainder of chapter 16. Roy, go right ahead.
I just want to say it's enjoyable hearing you flawlessly and confidently pronounce all those names.
Well, thank you for saying that. But as long as I'm consistent, we've had this conversation, as long as I'm consistent, hopefully most will know that I'm not wrong in what I'm saying. So, no, I appreciate you, Roy, and everybody else too. Thank you.